A big study on education in Michigan. Are we getting what we pay for? And does higher investment really mean better scores? Plus, a look at the new way to save struggling schools. Also, should the GOP dump Trump? And Detroit's creative future. Stay put. Nolan and Steven are here. My Week starts right now.
Did you know? Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago. In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there, welcome to My Week. I'm Christy McDonald. We have a lot going on this week. It may be summer vacation, but we're taking a deep dive into education tonight, funding and management. Plus, we're going to be debating the dump Trump philosophy, and we'll give you a closer look at encouraging the growth of creative industries in Detroit. It is all coming up for you, but we are going to be starting with schools. The governor just signed off on the budget, and for education, it's $16.1 billion. And the extra funding, well, it was a good thing. If you've seen a new report this week that says the state's funding for schools is becoming increasingly unequal, and districts that spend on average of $8,600 a student are the ones that are, quote, notably successful. Now, the study was commissioned by the state to see what it would take for students to meet the state's graduation requirements. Plus, we are now getting a first look at how the State School Reform Office is handling academically struggling schools. Not everyone is really happy with the CEO model that is being put in place in the East Detroit district. So let's get to it tonight with our My Week contributors, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Nolan Finley, and the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, Stephen Henderson. Guys, you like it? I threw in the whole title tonight so people know actually what we're dealing with here tonight. You know, there's been a lot of stuff about education in the news for the past 2 weeks or so. So I felt like it's kind of this whole scramble that we've got to kind of put together. And I think I want to start off with this study that came out that Michigan commissioned, taking a look at what it would take for our state to be on the same page. And I think, Nolan, let me start with you. When we're looking at the inequality of funding, how do we get back to a point where I guess, is money really solving it, and do you put more money for a better education?
Well, let's just start with this study. This study's, the conclusion of this study was foregone when it was commissioned. This firm that did the study finds the same answer in every state. It's always money, money, money. The governor should have never signed off on this. He let the Democrats bargain him into this study, which is now going to confuse the real conversation in Michigan.
So you say that the study's not even really legitimate?
You know, what the study does is put the cart way ahead of the horse. What are you funding with this more money? And that's the point we haven't got to in Michigan, is what it's going to take to make education better. And if the answer is simply a fatter check, we aren't going to get where the other states are, who have made fundamental changes in the way they educate their children and then added money. And we're still in the 21st century now. We're a decade and a half into it, still educating children basically the same way we did a century ago, lining them up in classrooms in front of a teacher and lecturing them and talking to them. There's got to be other methods to reach children who are programmed entirely different than they were when we were kids or our parents were kids.
Can you dispute, though, and maybe this is something that you guys are going to get into with each other, though, that when you have a certain amount of money and you've got a district that's able to pay for more books or able to pay for better facilities, able to pay for better teachers, or able to pay, that money can make a difference?
Yeah, well, I mean, flip that question on its head. Does inequality matter, right? Does it matter if you pay less for kids in desperate circumstances than you do in better circumstances? Of course it does. And you know, we've let that go for a long time in Michigan without addressing them. It's been 22 years since Proposal A, which made things better, more equal than they were before. But you know, it's starting to show its age in the sense that it's not doing that anymore. And this report points out ways that the gap is getting wider, not narrower. I mean, the truth is we have models for this. I mean, we always in Michigan sort of poo-poo what everyone else has done and don't look at, you know, success. Massachusetts is probably exhibit A of what happens when you do what Nolan's talking about, look at how you are educating kids, devise a system that's focused on their education and holds people accountable for that, and then adds money as well. They did both back in the early 1990s, and the results are not disputable. On the national test, the NAEP test, kids in Boston, black kids in poor schools in Boston, do better than the wealthy white kids in Michigan. There's still a gap in that state between how poor kids and wealthier kids do, but the wealthy kids in that state are at a level where they're competing internationally. They're not even competing with kids here in America anymore. And so there's no question that if you do that, if you concentrate on it, add the money and stick with it. That's the other thing that's key to Massachusetts. They haven't changed horses a million times.
You have to start with a plan. You have to start with a strategy.
Well, they did both at the same time.
We don't have one. We don't have a unified strategy. And it's not all about money. Highland Park had some of the highest per pupil funding in the state, and that district's going away.
Well, so but they keep trotting this out. People who don't want to add more money, they keep trotting out the Highland Park example. What that boils down to is the high number of kids they have in special ed, who in some cases get.
That wasn't the case in Highland Park.
It's a small district. If you had 3 or 4 kids who were getting $25,000 to $45,000 a year for their education, which they should under federal law, that skews the number.
Well, this report also says that there needs to be a comprehensive tracking program for special ed funding that Michigan doesn't currently have right now.
One of the bigger problems we have in terms of true inequity in funding is the legacy costs these districts have, and the amount of money that's not per pupil money that's not getting in the classroom. But even our well-funded districts in Michigan, even our affluent districts, are performing far worse than their peers across the country. We're in the bottom 10%, even in our affluent districts. We've got to figure out what we're going to do with this money before we raise it and spend it. We can't just keep thinking all we have to do is add more funds every year. When, we raise the foundation grant every year, and 30, 40, 50% of that never makes it to the classroom. It goes in to solving these long-term deficits we've built into the system.
All right, so then if we have a report like this come out, Stephen, and then so Nolan says, well, this was kind of skewed from the very beginning. Are we back to square one when it comes to having some kind of comprehensive plan coming out of where? The governor's office? Coming out of where? The legislature?
I mean, if this governor were more of a leader and more capable of leading the legislature to do the things he wanted to do, I'd have more faith in the idea that he could take this report and make something out of it. Of course, this is a governor who gets led by a majority in the legislature that, when it comes to education, is completely bought off and not interested in that larger discussion, not interested in either having it or coming up with what Nolan's talking about, which is a comprehensive plan, and won't fund it. So I don't know what will happen until those dynamics, those players are different.
How do you answer that?
Well, but in other states, it wasn't strictly a politically led reform.
So can we get away from that here,
Massachusetts, it was.
Can we get away from politically led reform?
William Weld put this stuff through the legislature and said, we're going to do it the socialist way. That's what he said. But we're going to put more money in poor districts than we do in wealthy.
In Tennessee, which is making huge progress, the business community led this. The business community fought for this and held the politicians accountable. And so it's managed to survive. Their efforts managed to survive changes from administration, from Republican to Democrat. Nothing we do in this state today in terms of education will survive a partisan change. And because we still haven't made this a priority. I don't think we even realize how poorly our schools are doing in comparison to the rest of them.
All right, well, speaking about the schools that are doing poorly, I want to address the whole idea of coming out of the state school reform office that now is under the control of the governor, and talking about dealing with academically struggling schools. For the past 6 years, they've had some kind of authority to be able to take over a school district. We haven't seen that implemented until now. So the East Detroit School District is going to be getting a CEO, and the
individual schools.
Individual schools. So talk to me about, is this now the way that we're going to be seeing struggling schools being handled? Because this is the conversation that we've heard coming out of the DPS conversation that, the states always had the ability to close poor performing schools or to deal with poor performing schools. Is this now the model that we're going to see, Stephen?
Maybe. I mean, the governor seems all in favor of this. I'm really skeptical of the effectiveness of this model. I'm not sure why just putting a CEO in charge changes outcomes again in the classroom. And again, this happens outside the context of this larger sort of refocusing on what schools should be doing and then what it costs us to do that. And so, you know, number one, I think it's a little bit of the backdooring of the emergency manager model that has not worked for school districts, hasn't worked for any school district, in fact, in Michigan. It's another way to sort of take that same model and perpetuate it in a way that bypasses the due process even that emergency management has. I'm really puzzled by the strategy here and why anyone thinks it'll produce something different than what we
Will this
have.
produce something different, do you think, Nolan?
I don't know. It feels to me like a reconstituted version of the EAA, which clearly didn't work. I don't see how simply bringing in I mean, before it was let's bring in a top principal and that'll change the school. That was the EAA theory. And now it's bringing in a CEO and it'll change it. It sounds to me the same. I think we keep trying to work around the reality that some of these schools can't be fixed. Some of these schools can't be saved. We got an overcap capacity of school seats in Detroit by about 40,000, 45,000 seats. And we've got 40 schools that are on the chronically failing list, 31 public, traditional public, 9 charters. Why not close those schools instead of keep trying to fix them, reduce the operating costs, reduce the overhead for the district, and maybe we can start to focus on schools that are working instead of fixing schools that don't.
So I guess my question is, so are we going to start to see more of an aggressive approach from the state? And that is, again, not
aggressive in what way?
Aggressive in terms of starting to close down or saying, you know what, now we're going to academically hold them accountable. Because that was, again, the whole conversation about not having a Detroit Education Commission when it came to the DPS bills was that authority can come from the state reform office.
State reform. I hope so.
I would hope so. I also think that the toothless version of the DEC that we got will be able to assert itself by doing what it can do, which is identifying the markers for success and failure in schools, and really putting pressure on people, the people who are going to be in charge of schools in Detroit, to fix schools or close them. I mean, I think the idea of closing schools is one thing. Our other problem in Detroit is that, and this is in Michigan, anybody can open a school. I mean, Nolan and I can come up with an idea for a school, get an application and have that thing up and running if we get funding by next year.
That's a school I think I'd like to see. I'd like to see that school.
If they can get an authorizer to back them. I think given the overcapacity in Detroit, I don't think you're going to see a whole lot
people
of
are not opening schools right now.
And that's in one sense that's a shame because there's some very good operators in the market who don't come here. I think the school reform office can play a role similar to what the DEC was supposed to look like. I would like to see them draw on the Detroit Education Coalition for an advisory board for the school reform office and bring in some community accountability. There's a lot of ways to make that work. We just got to start doing it.
All right, let's turn now to some presidential politics. Conservatives not too fond of Donald Trump as the GOP presidential nominee are trying to gather steam for the Dump Trump movement. Just a few days ago, the Detroit News advocated in an editorial that, quote, the GOP doesn't have to ride the Trump train out of Cleveland. Party rules allow for broad changes to the nominating process prior to the convention, so there's a roadmap for dumping Trump. For the sake of preserving their party, Republicans should follow it. So I'm going to start with the man who probably helped craft some of those words. Nolan, why did Detroit News put that editorial out?
Because I think, for the reasons stated, there's still time to avoid this disaster. And these sort of ardent Trump supporters believe that because they're so passionate and because there's this small group of Republican primary voters are so passionate, that's going to translate over the general election. And we've seen polls now every day come out. Ballotpedia had a poll out this morning in 7 battleground states, all 7 of them, including Michigan. Hillary Clinton beats Donald Trump. Our pollster measured Republican voters a couple of weeks ago and found that 27-28% of them say they don't think they can vote for Trump.
Yeah, but you had the
can't
head
even-
of the Michigan Republican Party coming out this week and saying,
her
come
job.
on now, we got to rally around our candidate,
her
number
job.
one. You shouldn't be following the dump Trump movement. Number two, then you had Bill Schuette came out this week and endorsing Trump. So
lot
you
of
still
people
have you still have the establishment here in Michigan saying,
You still
"Come on,
have,
we need to
you
stick
still
with that
have
guy.
part of the establishment here. You still haven't seen the funders rally to him. When you talk about a party's establishment, don't just look at the elected officials. The party's establishment are people who write the checks. And look at Trump's fundraising. $1.6 million. Candace Miller has raised more money in her drain commission race than that. This is going to be a disaster if they don't come to Cleveland and get a hold of themselves.
So, I mean, in theory, what Nolan's saying makes sense, right? It's a party, which is a private organization, sets its own rules.
So they can do pretty much
and they
essentially
can
whatever they
do
want.
whatever they want. I think the consequences of doing what Nolan is suggesting would also be absolutely devastating for that party. This is a party that's, by virtue of having nominated Donald Trump through the primary process, is in a real state of flux, and there's a real question about what that party looks like, what it stands for, who leads it after the election. I think you dump gasoline on that fire by saying, all right, all these people came out and voted and chose one person, but we are going to choose someone else.
But we're going to
Majority
invalidate all of that, all of those votes.
Majority
this
of
is
the
what-
primary voters voted against Donald Trump.
So this is one of the dynamics that led to changes in the convention system and the primary system anyway. I mean, the idea that somehow votes don't matter. I think whenever you open that door, you court suspicion, you court lack of faith, you court.
But a candidate has
people
certain
feeling-
responsibilities, and they've nominated this candidate, and he hasn't fulfilled his.
What's he not doing?
He hasn't formed a national organization. He hasn't done fundraising.
But those are not things that you-
He's
Is that
said
maybe the
since
party
the
should do for him?
nomination things that, in my view, disqualify him from the presidency. If you look at the polling. You just look at the polling. Almost anybody else beats Hillary Clinton.
So
the
here's
only
the-
Republican who doesn't
Well, let me-
beat Hillary Clinton is Donald Trump.
Hang on, let me ask you
You don't
this.
have to do this.
Let me ask you
actually
this. So,
not
but if you dump Trump and you say, all right, forget it, and the Republicans find some other way and put some other candidate up there, don't you think he maybe runs as a third party guy and says, well, forget it, now I'm going to blow everything up?
Well, he
Probably
could.
wants out of this.
He could. I mean, he certainly could do that. I don't see how the Republicans are any worse off. They may lose a third of their Republican voters if they dump Trump. They're losing a third of their Republican voters by keeping him on the ballot now.
more than that.
And you can't win this election just with Republican voters.
Well, you can't.
And he's got no appeal
What you
across
can't
the
do,
broad spectrum.
Well, and what you can't do, and this is what they won't talk about, is what you can't do is win.
But who won't talk about it?
Republicans, the leadership. What you can't do is win an election with white voters. You can't win with just white voters. And if you look at the polls right now, that extends beyond Donald Trump, right? Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, they're not going to get women to vote for them. They're not going to get Hispanics to vote for them.
I don't know if that's true.
There isn't a lot of daylight between what Donald Trump is saying to those constituencies and what the other candidates
You've got to
are saying.
consider that
The only
they're
person
running
who-
against a very flawed Democratic candidate whom a lot of Democratic voters aren't excited
so
about.
who?
Who has no appeal to independents.
So who are you going to nominate?
You know,
So who?
I think they should go to the convention and fight that out.
Who? But
Give
there's
us a
got to be
name.
someone there, though, that would be ready to step up to it. Who?
I still think, we still think John Kasich could do it.
So John Kasich, somebody who couldn't stay in the race,
Mm-hmm.
didn't win his own state in the primary. I think that's a really, really crazy conceit. The idea that you can just pluck somebody
look-
The guy in
who
sixth
voters
place.
rejected.
And then put him up.
Again,
Voters
you're
rejected
not going to
him.
win this election just with Republican voters. He has
don't think
broad
you're gonna
appeal
win that.
across the middle, and he could draw Democrats who are taking a look at Hillary Clinton and say, my God, she's got Nixon written all over her. We don't want to go there.
But
So-
if that were true, then why didn't more Republican voters support him in the primary?
Support who?
John Kasich.
We had a 16-person primary, and you had a very passionate,
How many people ran for
cultish
the...
group who got behind Trump. And if it had been a two-man race from the beginning,
But-
or a three-man race like it was on the Democratic side, Donald Trump wouldn't be the
But that's
nominee.
not what
hang on.
happened.
Let me say we got 30 seconds left in this segment. Nolan, you're going to be at the convention.
Yeah.
So give us an idea of what you're looking for.
I think it'll be chaos. I think it's going to be an absolute disaster at the convention. One, I think all of the George Soros-funded anarchists will be shutting down the streets, so you won't be lucky to have a convention. I think it's going to be a disaster.
And who's going to speak?
I don't know.
I mean,
having a
I
hard
think
time lining people up.
That's going to be that's going to be a big
Which
thing.
again is why I think the party, the funders and the party leaders should get a
You
hold
don't
of
think
this.
that?
All right. Okay. All right. Well, turning now to the resurgence of Detroit's creative economy. This week, the Detroit Creative Corridor Center, or DC3, launched a 10-year City of Design initiative, essentially how to promote and strengthen the economic impact of Detroit's creative industries. Well, I sat down with DC3's Olga Stella and Richard Rogers from the College for Creative Studies for a closer look. Olga, I'm going to start off with you. First of all, explain when we talk about the economic impact of creative industries in the city of Detroit. I think sometimes when we talk about this next resurgence and chapter of Detroit, we're not really thinking about creative industries or supporting them. What does that really mean?
Well, so people often have a limited view of what it means. And what we've been trying to do at the Detroit Creative Corridor Center is really expand that view. So it includes arts and galleries and things that people can relate to, but also includes real jobs producing opportunities, whether it's architecture, film and video, folks who do graphic design. I think when you start to look at people who do product, I mean, it's everywhere. And when you really start to peel back most of our traditional industries in the city, you can find the roots of creativity and design, companies in those sectors helping to support them.
And Rick, I mean, Detroit has a very storied history when it comes to design. Give us a little bit of fill us in on that.
Well, you could really say that Detroit's industrial history was kind of driven by design, although it goes back so far that it started before the word design really came into vogue. But industrial design is the area where that involves designing automobiles, designing just about every kind of product that we have in our lives, whether it's our electronic devices or kitchen appliances or athletic shoes. That's all part of industrial design. And Detroit is really the birthplace of industrial design because back in the early 1930s, General Motors brought a guy named Harley Earl from the West Coast to Detroit to start what they then called the art and color section. And that kind of immediately shows you the connection between art and what today we call design. And Harley Earl was really the first true designer in the auto industry and developed a lot of the techniques that are still used today in the design of automobiles, and then those techniques and methodologies have spread to all other kinds of fields that we call design today.
All right, so we fast forward to where we are in Detroit today, and this week you launched kind of like a 10-year vision for what the next chapter of the city is going to be like in terms of design and in terms of those creative industries, Olga. So explain what possibly is a 10-year plan and what does that look like?
Right. So in December, Detroit was designated a UNESCO City of Design by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, and we're the only one in the United States to receive this designation. One of 22 cities around the world and part of a 116 member network of cities that are committed to using creativity to drive their city's future. So to your point, Christy, what does that mean? What we want to do, when we've looked at the other cities of design that have had real economic impacts, grown jobs, increased the number of firms, seen the creative sectors really develop, they've had a single vision. They've come around either entrepreneurship or placemaking, something that can help organize all their efforts. And what we launched this week was really just the starting point. We're going to take the next 9 to 12 months to work across our community to really build what that vision is. What is it that's unique about Detroit, our assets and our opportunities that can help pull us all together around that singular vision so that people in academia, people in industry, community, policymakers can contribute their activities towards realizing that vision.
So Rick, what are some of the things that you're starting to hear from people saying, okay, now is when we start to take a look, these are some of the things that must be in place for Detroit when we start talking about it?
Well, certainly we're going to, as Olga said, we're going to build on the assets that we have. So we already have some things in place, like we have a very strong education in creative fields. We have a very strong creative sector, but as you suggested, not as visible as it needs to be. We do think there needs to be a big educational component to this because design is still a very esoteric subject, and people need to understand how it really affects and infects our lives, infects in a good way, and how it can be used as a powerful tool to effect change and to improve the quality of people's lives. So we have to spend a lot of time kind of educating people what the potential is here, and then the other piece that's really important is participation. If this is not a broad-based initiative that brings a lot of people together, both people who are already kind of initiated into the world of design and people who come to learn about it and see how it can be useful. If we don't do that, then it will not be a successful initiative.
All right, and you can see my whole interview with Olga and Rick at MiWeek.org. And that is going to do it for MiWeek this week. Have a great holiday weekend. Make sure you meet us back here next week on Detroit Public Television. I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next time for MiWeek. Take care.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.